Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Environment in Milk, Get the Facts, a webinar organized by Dairy Farmers of Canada's team of registered dietitians. My name is Joanne Gallagher. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition specialist at Dairy Farmers of Canada and your moderator for today. We're just thrilled to welcome all of you with more than 1,000 registrants from right across the country today. The 45-minute presentation will be followed by a 15-minute question period. You can send your questions through the chat box at any time, and note that we'll try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. To download the presentation, simply click the link at the bottom of your screen. It is, and it's been very important for the Canadian dairy production sector to understand its environmental impacts. Canadian dairy farmers live and work on their farms every day, so they care about protecting the land, the water, and the air for their families, neighboring communities, and their future generations. Farmers want their farms to be part of the physical and social landscape well into the future because they want their farms to be passed on to their children. This sector has been investing in research for more than 2 decades in Canada in order to ensure it's continually moving forward. That includes research and practices that improve animal health, the environment, and milk quality. Dairy farmers aspire to be leading edge in their production practices and economically and environmentally sustainable while producing a high-quality, nutritious product. As dietitians and healthcare professionals, we're all aware of the importance of promoting sustainable dietary practices while optimizing our clients' and patients' nutritional health. So in that light, we hope that we can answer some of your questions today around milk, production, and the environment. I'm now really pleased to introduce Mr. JEAN-MICHEL Couture. JEAN-MICHEL is a partner and senior consultant at Groupe AGECO. As an agricultural economist, JEAN-MICHEL has experience in agricultural policy and international trade. He's an expert in the field of corporate social responsibility and has participated in several Canadian and European projects involving the review, evaluation, and development of sustainability standards, in particular in the field of social life cycle analysis. JEAN-MICHEL's focus is to help organizations assess, understand, and improve their environmental and socioeconomic performance. With that, I'll turn the session over to JEAN-MICHEL.
Thank you, Joanne, for the introduction, and welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today for this webinar entitled The Environment and Milk, Get the Facts. So, as the title suggests, my objective today is to demystify some of the concepts, data, and results pertaining to the environmental impact of milk production here in Canada. Because, as you certainly know, there is an ongoing discussion happening globally, but also in Canada, regarding the impact of agricultural production and livestock production in particular, but also of the impact of our dietary patterns and the way we eat. So in that context, my intent today is actually provide some background information needed to better understand how the impact and the footprint and the environmental impact of food products such as milk is usually measured, but also to describe and present the current performance of milk production in Canada from an environmental standpoint, and also describe and present how this footprint evolved over time and why. So the information I'll be presenting today is based on a report that was commissioned by the Dairy Farmers of Canada in 2017 and published in 2018, a report that Groupe AGECO had the opportunity to conduct and realize. As Joanne mentioned at the beginning, so there will be the presentation and then 15 minutes to answer any of your questions. So please do not hesitate to write them down as I'm walking through the presentation, and I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions regarding the presentation and the results of the study. So moving forward. forward. So the outline of the presentation goes as follows. First, I want to take a step back in a few minutes to present the life cycle assessment methodology, which was used to measure the footprint and the environmental performance of milk production in Canada. So you will hear me a lot using this acronym, the LCA, so the life cycle assessment, because, I mean, when we hear a lot, I mean, today it's becoming more and more mainstream to talk about the footprint of products or companies or organizations or even industries as a whole. And when you hear about the concept of footprint, usually it's based on the LCA methodology, and that was the methodology we used in that project. So in order to understand why this methodology is used so widely and the meaning of the results underlying it, so I think it's important to talk a bit about this approach. Then I'll move on and present the objectives of the project, so basically the goal and scope of the study I was referring to, and how we actually conducted the whole assessment. And then I'll spend more time presenting the results themselves. So of course, spending more time regarding on the carbon footprint, which is maybe the most important or most widely used indicator when we think about the sustainability and the environmental sustainability of our product. But I'll also have a look and discuss the other environmental indicators that we looked at in this study, because I mean, sustainability is something that covers a lot of ground, especially on the environmental side. Then I'll complete and conclude the presentation by linking this result and this study as a whole to the overall discussion regarding how sustainable food is and how sustainable our diets can be, and to see to what extent and how these results actually fit in that discussion and can contribute to the conclusions and recommendations coming out of that. But before I jump into the presentation itself, so a quick word about Groupe AGECO. So we're a consulting company. We're based in Quebec. So we've been around for about 20 years now. Our team is comprised of 20 professionals. So most of us are ag economists, so professionals in the agricultural sector. But my colleagues are also engineers and communication experts. And over the last 20 years, we've been working with pretty much all the key players in the agri-food sector here in Canada, but also in the States and in Europe, to help them understand their social, economic, and environmental performance, and then from these results, make more informed decisions about how the way they can improve their performance over time. And of course, this is with that experience and expertise that we've been supporting the dairy farmers of Canada in their assessment of milk production here. And this, of course, leads me to share full disclosure with you. So as you figured out at this point, of course, the study that is the basis of this presentation, as well as this presentation, was mandated and commissioned by the Dairy Farmers of Canada, and Groupe AGECO received honoraria to conduct and present this presentation. But I can assure you that Groupe AGECO, as an expert in corporate social responsibility and sustainability, walks the talks when it's time to conduct their projects and conduct their studies. So we can, and I can guarantee the full independence and objectivity in the preparation and presentation of these results. So now let's move on and jump into the presentation itself, starting with the presentation of the LCA methodology. So like I said in the beginning, I'm sure you heard and you're hearing a lot about the concept of environmental footprint, especially in the agri-food sector. And when we talk about the diets and the type of food we eat, so the thing is, nowadays it's becoming more and more mainstream to talk about that footprint and the idea of environmental impacts of companies and food systems. And actually, there is every couple of weeks now we see a report or an article in a newspaper referring to the impact and the challenges we're facing as society dealing with those environmental impacts. But the thing that we need to remember is that these results and this data are pretty and rather recent, and these are studies that are just taking place right now, and more data are coming in as organizations are conducting such studies. But what I want to highlight here at this point is the fact that the Dairy Farmers of Canada have actually been forerunners in the development and use and implementation of the LCA methodology here in Canada. The organization back in 2012 was the first commodity group in Canada to conduct a national LCA of their production. And the results were published in 2012 based on 2011 data. This first assessment took place as part of a research project, and the intent back in the days was to establish the first baseline of what is the footprint of producing milk in Canada, and what are the main contributors. So what are the factors impacting the most the environment when we're producing milk? So back in the days, in 2012, it was the first organization doing this work, and they actually were, the Dairy Farmers of Canada, the first organization globally to conduct an environmental and social life cycle assessment of their operation, because they also looked back then to the social and economic performance of their activity. So that's something to highlight, I believe, and also the fact that 5 years later, actually they decided to update this result, and this is basically the result and the study I'm referring to today. So in 2018, the update of that first report was released based on 2016 data. So the organization remained proactive in understanding and communicating about their footprint. So like I said, nowadays the idea of the environmental footprint or impacts of producing different types of commodities and food products is becoming more and more mainstream. And actually today, LCAs are part of the Canadian sustainability landscape. I won't list all the organizations on this slide here, and this is just a sample of Canadian organizations. But I have to say that most commodity groups, as well as companies, processors, retailers, now have whether conducted or are involved in LC-related projects. So that's the case in the beef sector, the eggs industry, in the chicken sector as well. The pork sector has been really, really active on that front as well. The same applies to the grain and the plant-based industry that invested together over the last few years a significant amount of time and resources in conducting such studies. Now the question is, why would so many organizations spend time and invest scarce resources in conducting LCAs and conduct such LCA-related projects? Well, the answer to that question is the fact that LCA can actually provide answers to numerous critical questions facing the agri-food industry. Well, the first item that comes to mind when we think about that is all the environmental challenges we're facing as society. We all hear about the climate change impacts, the fact that there are many activities affecting the air and water quality, the fact that right now many regions are facing water and resources scarcity, as well as the impact on biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So the idea there, we know about those challenges and we know about those issues, but what is not necessarily super clear is to what extent a specific industry or product is contributing more or less to those challenges. And by conducting LCA, an industry or a sector, such as the Canadian dairy sector, can better understand having access to quantitative and robust data, can understand the impact of their activities on those concerns and issues. And it's not only about understanding the negative impact of their activities. It's also a way to understand what could be or what are the positive contributions of the sector to those challenges. And you may have heard about carbon sequestration in the soils, or the fact that some industry can actually help recycle waste or revalorize some products that would otherwise impact the environment. So this is a methodology in a way to better understand how an industry can be part of the solution and not only be impacting the environment. It's also a way, using LCA, to make more informed decisions. And this is true in regards to consumers' expectations. I mean, as citizens, as consumers, most of us try to find ways to reduce our impact on the environment. So some of us may want to buy and purchase more organic products, go for non-GM products, adopt and be part of the slow food movement, or try to promote local sourcing or local purchases. And the thing is, there may be some counterintuitive impacts, or there may be some consequences or trade-offs related to those different market expectations or market demands. So by using LCA results, the industry or any actors in the industry can actually provide science-based information to consumers to make sure that we provide the right information and make the right decision when it's time to reduce our impact on the environment. So it's true for consumers, it's also true for the government. So of course, as a society, we want to manage those concerns and manage those challenges. So there is new laws coming in and trying to, let's say, regulate the carbon tax. We can think about animal welfare, regulation on pesticides. So many policies, many programs are being designed and implemented to reduce the impact of our activities on the environment. And again, to make sure that these initiatives are effective to address the environmental impacts they try to achieve, it's important to have access to sound information that is provided by LCA results and studies. And lastly, one of the key reasons why organizations in the agri-food sector, or in other industries as well, are conducting LCA is because the results can be used as a solid building block, on which you can develop a sustainability or corporate social responsibility journey by understanding your footprint, identify best practices, measure your results, and communicate your performance over time. So these are all the reasons why LCA is becoming so mainstream, and then you hear more and more about the footprint of products, and especially in the agri-food sector. Now, I talked a lot about LCA to say why it's so important and why it's so useful, but I didn't say anything regarding what it is actually and how it works. So the key item there is the fact that LCA is an internationally recognized method. So it's not something that AGECO developed or came up with. It's actually something that is standardized by ISO standards. So when a practitioner, such as AGECO or any other practitioner, wants to develop an LCA, they have to follow specific guidelines. The other key characteristic of LCA studies is the fact that they look at the environmental impact of a product or organization from a cradle-to-grave perspective. So we do not only look at the impact related, let's say, to producing milk or consuming milk. They look at the impact of the entire value chain, the entire life cycle, starting with the production of the raw inputs and the extraction of the raw materials needed throughout the life cycle of the product, in order to produce the feed, conduct the operations on the farm, transport, process product, use it at home, and then manage the end of life and the waste of it. So by adopting this comprehensive and systematic vision, you can avoid what I like to call a false good solution. So something that you may think has a good impact on the environment, but when you look at the complete picture, then you realize that there are other impacts that might actually be higher elsewhere in the whole system. A good example of that would be packaging. So you may think that by removing the packaging at one stage of the supply chain is a good thing because, by removing the packaging, then you reduce the waste and you reduce the impact overall. But the reality is, if the packaging helps preserving the food for a longer time and manage to avoid that food to be going to waste and going to a landfill, you may want to reconsider your assessment, and at the end of the day, using an LCA approach, you may realize that the overall impact, environmental footprint of that product using the packaging is actually lower than not using it. So this is where the results of such study can actually lead to counterintuitive results, which leads to better, more informed decisions. So, and lastly, the last characteristic of LCA is the fact that it's multi-indicators. So you're looking not only at one set of impacts, but at more than one. And again, this enables users of LCAs to better understand the trade-offs from an environmental standpoint of conducting specific activities. So like I said earlier, so LCA is also a science-based approach. So practitioners, are strongly have strong incentives to actually use international standards and guidelines when conducting such studies. And there are guidelines for different sectors, including in the dairy sector, dairy industry. So different organizations are developing those standards and making sure that you streamline the way you're defining the system and assessing the impact of its activities. So this is, again, just to let you know that it's a science-based approach with pros and cons, because you have to realize that science is a slow-evolving process, and building new knowledge is a slow thing. So when you want to conduct an LCA, you have to build your assessment on consensus and things that are well established. So there are some insights, some considerations that are not yet as consensual in terms of how to capture some environmental impacts. And this is not necessarily something that is taken into account in LCA because it's based on well-established science results. And the last word regarding the methodology, as I was saying, there are many, many indicators that could be used to assess in a more comprehensive and systematic way the environmental impact of producing different products, such as milk. But the most frequently measured indicators are the carbon footprint, such related to climate change, the water use, and the natural resources, such as land use or, again, energy consumption. But you may come across studies, mainly coming from the academic world, where you will see other indicators such as biodiversity and human health. These indicators are not as well established from a methodological standpoint, but they are out there as well, and this exemplifies the fact that as science is evolving, more and more indicators are taken into account to have a more comprehensive understanding of the different impacts of our activities on the environment. So now I tried in the last few minutes to present what is LCA, what is an LCA study, why people are using it, and what are the benefits. So now, with this in mind, let's move on and talk a bit more specifically about the project objectives and the approach, so basically the goal and scope of the project commissioned by the Dairy Farmers of Canada. So let's start with the objective, which is, of course, is the first and major starting point. So the idea in 2017, when we started the project, was to provide an environmental assessment of current practices of the industry and measure its evolution over a 5-year period. In other words, the idea back then was to quantify the footprint of milk production in Canada in 2016. The study took place and started actually in 2017, but we had to establish a temporal baseline, which was to 2016. Once that was done, the idea was to update the 2011 results in order to be able to compare the 2016 to the 2011 results, and using the same methodology, so using the updated approach, to make sure that we can compare apples to apples and then be able to understand if and to what extent and why the footprint evolved over that 5-year period. So the goal is, of course, of critical importance, but the scope of the study is also super important to understand the meaning of the results. So in an LCA, like I said, the scope could be a cradle-to-grave scope or perspective, so the whole life cycle. In this specific project, the scope was a cradle-to-processor's gate scope. So that means that all the activities, all the processes, all the impacts were captured, starting from the production of raw resources, starting with the mineral and the energy and all this, all the resources needed to conduct all the activities, and the system stopped at the processing plant level. So this includes, like I said, all the production of the resources needed to conduct the activities, and then more specifically, all the energy needed on farm and all to build the infrastructure, to conduct the activities, to produce the feed needed to feed the animals, and then, of course, all the activities to manage livestock and the animals, and all, of course, the emissions and the output of that production, such as manure and so on and so forth. So the transportation of milk to the processor's gate was also included in the system, and what we came up with and where the system ends is actually raw milk. So the other important aspect here I want to mention is the fact that when we talk about LCA, there is always a functional unit. So basically a common denominator used to report the impacts. For that project, the functional unit was 1 kilogram of fat and protein-corrected milk produced on a Canadian farm and transported to a processor's facility. So all the results I'll be presenting in a minute are reported on basically a 1 kilogram of raw milk. Another critical aspect when conducting LCA is, of course, the data sources and the quality of the data available. Which is a great news in Canada is the fact that we have access in general, and specifically in the agri-food sector, to reliable data. And when we have access to reliable data on a specific sector or activity, when we can expect reliable results. So here, like I said, we had access and we used high-quality data from secondary sources, including data from government statistic agencies, nationally and provincially. Also, the data from different agencies operating in the dairy sector. We also used an innovative approach in that project to complete the secondary data by collecting data at the farm level. And we did that through a survey at the farm level, and close to 600 farmers across the country participated in that survey. And this survey helped us document the best practices implemented on the farm in 2016 and 2011 to make sure that we understand what's happening and to to be able to model the impact of those practices in the results. So the other key item there is the modeling. So the results I'll be presenting in a minute is based on a national assessment, so it's a national average, but it takes into account the provincial specificities and characteristics. So we all know Canada is a huge country, and producing milk in Quebec and producing it in Alberta is quite different. I mean, the context, the geography, so many variables are different across the country. So it's important to have reliable results and representative results to take into account these characteristics, and this is what we did in that project. And of course, you can be assured that, like I mentioned earlier, LC is a science-based approach, and the latest guidelines were used to make sure that the results are consistent and robust. So now we can move on and talk a bit more about the results themselves, starting with the carbon footprint and then the other environmental indicators. So here on that slide, you will have the results of the environmental footprint of Canadian milk in 2016 and 2011. So I will just walk really slowly in that slide to make sure that all the key messages and information is well understood. So the key message here is, of course, the fact that the carbon footprint, water consumption, and land use, which are the three indicators that we captured in that study, associated with milk production, and again, it's 1 kilogram of fat and protein-corrected milk in Canada. Well, this footprint for the three indicators decreased by 7.3, 5.6, and 10.9% respectively between 2011 and 2016. So, and you see those results on the figures below here on the slide. So when you look at the figures, what do you realize? Well, in the first thing is, of course, we see that between the 5 years period, we see that decrease of the footprint. Let's say the carbon footprint moving from 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent to 0.92. The same with the water consumption, 27.3 liters per kilogram of milk to 25.8. And then on the land use, so 1.9 square meter per year per kilogram of milk to 1.7 square meter per year of land use needed to produce milk. So what you see here as the other, I would say the other main result there is the fact that the contribution of each life cycle stage that are represented here by the different color code you see on the graph, so going from feed production, livestock management, transport, and so on and so forth, didn't change much over the period. So you realize, for instance, that the contribution of feed production in the land use indicator is pretty much the same. I mean, the main factors contributing to the footprint remain the same over the period. So the main difference here is the fact that the intensity of producing milk was diminished, was reduced significantly over this 5 years period. So in a nutshell, the idea there is the fact that the industry was able to produce more milk using less resources. In fact, the better cow productivity is the main driver explaining the improvements in the environmental profile of producing milk over the 5 years period. So the productivity actually increased by 13% over the period, and this is the main driver explaining these changes in the results you see in the figure. But productivity is not the only reason why the improvement in the situation got better over the years in the industry. Actually, farmers also adopted best practices, which helped reduce the footprint over time. Because as you will see in a minute again, there are some major areas that are more affecting the footprint than others. And for those areas, such as feed efficiency, manure management, crop production, well, the survey enabled us to capture the fact that farmers was moving and progressing towards the adoption of practices having a less impact on the environment. So I won't get too technical here, but just to let you know that, let's say, on the seed side, producers moved towards a more optimized ration formulation, reducing the impact of enteric fermentation, for instance, as we'll see. They also have better management practices in regards to manure storage and also adopting new practices to deal and manage with that manure, such as composting and anaerobic digestion. The same applies with crop production, and we'll see again in a minute that crop production is a major factor affecting the footprint. So producers start adopting even better practices, going from tillage practices, crop rotation, and adopting technologies enabling them to use less resources to produce more grain and higher yields in crop production. So again, it's a mix of increasing the productivity and adopting good practices that made a difference over 5 years in reducing the footprint of the industry. Now, if we want to have a closer look at the footprint of the Canadian milk, producing milk, So like I said earlier, the result in 2016 shows that the production of 1 kilogram of milk produces 0.92 kilogram of CO2 equivalent in 2016. So, of course, the result itself is quite interesting. It's good to know, to set a baseline again and to compare that baseline to the 2011 baseline and to see, like I said, that there's a decrease of 7.3% in that regard. So the result is useful. But when you conduct an LCA, the idea is not just to get a result and run with it. The idea is to understand what is contributing the most to that impact, to that result, in order to be able to improve that impact over time, to reduce your impact over time. And when you look at the graph on this slide, then you realize that there are a few stages in the life cycle that are impacting quite a lot that overall footprint of Canadian milk. Actually, there are three main factors contributing the most to that footprint. The first one is enteric emissions, which account almost to half of the main of the overall carbon footprint of milk and Canadian milk. So here, enteric emissions are related to enteric fermentation. So basically, these are the gases produced by the animals, in this case cows, when they are digesting the feed they are given. So I just wanted here to highlight and mention something is the fact that in many cases, and even among some professionals, we hear that cows are actually farting, and this is their fart that are impacting climate change. The reality is they are burping. That doesn't change much at the end of the day in terms of the impact on the environment. But I just want to highlight that and make sure that it's all clear. Cows are mostly burping methane coming from enteric emissions, fermentation. So just to make sure that it's all clear for everyone. So this is the main factor contributing to the carbon footprint. So basically, cows burp. But the two other factors there, which are actually related, is feed production, which accounts for almost 30% of the overall footprint, and the manure management, which is again accounts for close to 20%. It's interesting to realize that there are close connections between enteric emissions, which are related to what cows eat, feed production, which is, of course, how you produce the feed given to the animals, and the manure management, so basically how you deal with basically the output of cows after they digested their food. So if you want to play and reduce the impact of enteric emissions of cows, then you may have to adapt the type of ration and feed that are given to them, which will have also an impact on the manure they produce. And of course, manure is being used to fertilize the soil that is used to produce crops, that is then used to develop and produce the feed given to the animals. So the idea there, you have to understand that when we're talking about food, and especially of livestock production, we're talking about a system. It's something that is living. It's all interconnected. So if you want to reduce the impact of a specific stage in the life cycle, you need to adopt a systematic, comprehensive understanding on all the interactions affecting the system, because you cannot adapt and play with one variable without considering all the other impacts and the consequences with the other variables. So this is what makes, let's say, the LCA and understanding the environmental impact of food production so complicated, because it's not a car factory when you can just play and replace a piece. It's something that is all tightly related. Another interesting insight coming from this figure here is the fact that energy use and milk transportation contribute to about 6% of the life cycle impact of this overall system. So this is not to say that there is no room for improvement regarding the energy use on farms and the impact of transportation on the environment. The thing is, when you look at the overall picture from a life cycle perspective, then you realize that these are maybe not the main hotspots. These are maybe not the main factors on which you want to act on first. So if we move on and now look at the other indicators, the water consumption and land use results. So like I said earlier, the production of 1 kilogram of milk consumes 25.8 liters of water and uses 1.7 square meters of land in 2016. So if we look first at the water indicator, it's interesting to realize that 44% of the water consumption is on-farm production, is related basically to on-farm production of animal feed, and only a quarter is related to direct use on farm to water the animals or clean buildings. So again, in the life cycle perspective, we realize that the bulk of the water use is not related to livestock per se. it's related to crop production. And again, you have to look at the issue from a life cycle, the supply chain perspective. So it's not only one stage. It's actually something that comes as a whole system. And then when we look more specifically at the land use result, then you realize that 85% of the land use is to produce feed on site. And and when you look at the feed production as a whole, so the feed farmers buy, it's almost 95%. So of course, most of the impact related to land use is related to feed production, so basically producing crops. So it's always interesting to put these numbers in context because it's not always super intuitive to understand what does that mean, 25.8 liters of water or something like that. So here, in the case of water, just to let you know, so using 25.8 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of milk is equivalent to a shower, less than 3 minutes of shower, basically. So it's not that much. It's always clumsy to use such equivalencies, but still it's a way to understand the impact of these numbers. Regarding the water use as well, I just want to highlight another item that is not on the slide. It's the fact that irrigation is a key contributor to the water footprint in general. And here in Canada, we're not using much irrigation in general, and especially not to produce the feed needed to feed the animal. So this is, again, another important aspect to consider because in other regions, for other commodities, the use of irrigation might be, or actually is, much higher. And as soon as you use irrigation to produce something, the water footprint of that product is skyrocketing. And again, this is a kind of a good characteristic here in Canada of our food system, is that we're not using that much irrigation. As for the land use indicator, again, if we put things a bit into context, then we realize that if you take the overall milk production for a year, let's say in 2016, while the amount of land used is similar, is equivalent to less than 3% of Canada agricultural land use. So it's not that much when you take into account, when you consider the importance of the industry. So this is where you realize, again, that these numbers have to be put into context to understand their meaning. So, of course, the objective of that study was not to compare this result with others out there. So the idea was not to compare the performance or the impact of producing 1 kilogram of milk in Canada to the impact of producing it elsewhere around the world. So the idea was to understand the impact of producing milk here and understand and to compare it to the past performance in order to improve the situation over time. That being said, having these numbers at hand, it's always useful and interesting to put them again in context and understand where Canada sits or stands when it comes to its environmental impact of producing milk. So to do that, we referred to data provided by the FAO, so the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and that organization, using a similar methodology, calculated the LCA, so the carbon footprint of different milk-producing regions. So you have the results on this graph here. And then when you look at that here, you realize that there are basically two groups. So a very efficient group comprised of Oceania, North America, Russia, and Europe, basically, and a less efficient group, which is basically the rest of the world. And then when you look at these groups, these results, and look at the Canadian results, then you realize that Canada is among the regions that produce milk with the smallest carbon footprint. So the idea is not to say that we're better than our neighbor. The idea is just to highlight the fact that we're among the regions where we are producing milk the most effectively. And the reason for that is that we have access here in Canada to very high quality feed, and we have a really high productivity rate. So that enables us to actually produce milk very effectively and efficiently from an environmental standpoint. So another way to look at the graphic is the fact that if you have to produce milk somewhere around the world, Canada is definitely an efficient region where you can do that. So now, as a conclusion, I think, it's so far what I did was like to present the result of that study. So basically to summarize, what LCA is about, how it works, and then to present the results of using this methodology to measure the performance from an environmental standpoint of producing milk in Canada. But now I want to bring and link this discussion back to that broader debate about the impact of our dietary patterns and the food we eat on the environment. Because, like I said in the introduction, you certainly know about, this ongoing discussion of the impact on food and the recommendations that are coming from some studies and reports trying to connect health and the environment. Because, more and more studies and reports are being published recently, and one good example of that is the Eat Lancet report that was published in January earlier this year. And these reports try to connect, like I said, the nutritional benefits or impacts of some dietary patterns to their environmental impacts or, contribution. And some of the conclusions of these reports are really bold and actually pretty strong. And for instance, in their report, in the Eat Lancet report, the authors concluded that the consumption of foods such as red meat and sugar will have to be reduced by more than 50% in order to meet the objective of fighting climate change, basically. And that a diet rich in plant-based food and with fewer animal sources food should be promoted in order to improve health and environmental benefits. So we see more and more of these reports coming out at the international level with such strong conclusions and recommendations. And what's interesting is the fact that by conducting such LCAs, such as the Dairy Farmers of Canada did in this case, but other industries as well, it's a way to contribute to that debate on sustainable diets. Because, it's actually quite legitimate to look at the impacts of sustainable diets and products specifically, but it's important to keep in mind that this is, like I said, a very complex reality that needs to take into account sound and reliable data. And the fact that right now many studies that are being published at this point use data that are not always representative of the actual performance, in this case, of the Canadian dairy industry, but the same would apply to other industries such as chicken or eggs or pork and so on and so forth. So right now, what happens is that many of those studies are being conducted using international average and data that are not necessarily super specific to the reality we find in the different regions or the different sectors. So here, the graphic on this slide highlights this reality there, and we see on the far left the carbon footprint used in the Eat Lancet report in their model to understand the impact of, let's say, using dairy in their diet. And then we realize that their data is 1.2 kilogram of CO2 equivalent. When we look at the data we have in Canada, so more specific, based on more reliable data, then we realize that already in 2011, the footprint was actually not of over 1.2, but likely just basically of 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent. And in 2016, this footprint was even lower. And given the time frame used in the Eat Lancet report, which is 2050, it's likely that the footprint of the Canadian milk sector, dairy sector, will actually be much, much lower. So this is where it's so important for an industry such as the Canadian dairy sector to conduct such LCA to make sure that we can provide to researchers and any organizations documenting the impact of food and dietary patterns have access to reliable, strong, and representative data to be able to add to the discussion on sustainable diets. Because it's important to recognize that, of course, agricultural production and the animal livestock sector in particular is of course, under increased public scrutiny regarding the impact on the environment, and for very good reasons. There are significant impacts and they need to be addressed in order to make sure that our food and our system as a whole are more sustainable. The thing is, at this point, we're still in the process of understanding and developing new knowledge and making sure that the science is keeping up to speed in the way we can actually capture the complexity of those systems before we can make strong and solid recommendations on the data we have. And as of now, it's so important to have access to strong, representative, and reliable data to make sure that our conclusions and, more importantly, our recommendations are correct. And as of now, it is not yet the case in all situations. So in this context, this is why revising the LCA of Canadian milk, such as what the Dairy Farmers of Canada has been doing over the last few years, is so important, not only in that sector, but in all the industry, to make sure that the industry have access to the right data on the current profile, footprint, understand the road, the gains over time, and make sure that they can develop some strategy in order to improve the situation over time. And this is just a piece in the puzzle, because of course today we talked a lot about the impact of milk production on the environment. But of course the environment is just one component, one pillar of sustainability. So if you want to really capture the complexity of what is really a sustainable food system or a food diet, then you have to capture all the aspects of sustainable development. And I think that a good way to keep that in mind is actually to refer back to the definition of what are sustainable diets that was provided and designed by the FAO in 2010. And that organization back in the days defined the sustainable diets as diets with low environmental impact, for sure, but that also contribute to food and nutrition security and healthy life for present and future generations. Such diets should also be protective and respectful of biodiversity, ecosystems, should also be culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy. So as you can see, when we talk about sustainability, we have to keep in mind, of course, and have access to the sound and reliable data on the environmental impacts, but we need not to overlook the impact on the other pillars of sustainability. So maybe my closing remark would be that right now, when we try, all of us professionals in the industry, trying to better understand the impact of producing milk or just like developing new sustainable diets, it's important to adopt a systematic, interdisciplinary, and science-based perspective to make sure that we understand and measure all the impacts of agriculture on population health and well-being in the environment. So this is why it's so important to keep this complexity in mind. So, and complexity that I think is exemplified by this figure over there you see on the right on this slide, which is provided by an organization which mission is to better understand and capture the definition of sustainability in the agri-food system. And as you can see, there are many, many variables and a lot of interaction between them. And I think this figure exemplifies and is a good way to understand what kind of mindset we need to focus on when we want to understand how sustainable a diet is and what variables we need to better document to understand the complexity of that. And I think the healthy result is definitely a building block in that overall discussion. So again, thank you so much for your time, and for the remaining time, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Great. Thank you, Jean-Michel. That was really an informative presentation, and I'm sure we're all eager now to dig into some of the questions that have been coming in. We did, just a quick note, we did receive a few questions related to milk processing. However, obviously the information we've presented here through the LCA today is related to on-farm milk production, so we're going to keep the focus of our questions on that area. So one of the first questions, Jean-Michel, is that you mentioned that we're now producing more milk with less input and fewer cows in Canada. And so the question is, what's the impact of this extra milk production on the cows themselves, for example, their welfare?
That's a very good question, and this again exemplifies the fact that when things are all interconnected, so of course we can think about the economic profitability of producing something, the environmental impact of doing it, and what are the impacts on the animal welfare. So that's actually a great question. What I can say is that from the animal, so there's a lot. There have been a lot of efforts being made on the genetics of the animals over the last, since many years now. And what we have to realize is that cows nowadays in Canada are much bigger than they used to be, like say 50 years ago. So when we talk about the productivity of the animals, it's the fact on the one hand, the animals are more productive themselves. I mean, they're physically different from those that were that existed 50 years ago. The other thing as well is the fact that they are being fed in a more optimized fashion. So I mean, there is a lot of research happening as well to make sure that the animals are being fed in a more optimized way, so that way they're producing more milk and being more effective. And on the other hand, I mean, right today we talk a lot about corporate social responsibility, about sustainability, but there's an ongoing discussion as well taking place in Canada about public trust and the corporate social responsibility and how actually producers and livestock producers in particular are treating their animals. So there's a lot of efforts and actually initiatives taking place, especially in the dairy sector, to make sure that producers are following guidelines developed by veterinarians together with the government and other practitioners to make sure that the best practices are being adopted to make sure that the animals are healthy and actually benefit from great conditions in terms of housing and the conditions under which they are basically reared. So all that to say that overall this increase in productivity, of course, wasn't made and obtained in a way that was detrimental on the animal welfare. I would say it's quite the opposite, because nowadays there are more and more regulations and policies in place to ensure that the animals, especially in the dairy sector, are treated in the best way possible.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer, and really helpful, I'm sure, to everybody listening. Another question that's come in is whether or not there is public access to the LCA reports.
There is a summary available online. As for the complete report, I will invite you to refer to the Dairy Farmers of Canada, so the organization, to know if there is an opportunity to access the complete report. But there is a link online to access the summary, which provides basically the key information that was presented today. Great,
thank you. Okay, another question that's come in. How is the dairy LCA, or carbon footprint, in comparison to other industries or products? So for example, chicken, lentils, plant-based beverages, etc.
Well, that's a very, of course, critical question, a really good question. Well, it's actually it's harder than we think, and we could actually imagine to compare those results together, and I'll explain why. First of all, because when these studies are being conducted, usually their scope, so the golden scope, is to understand the impact of a specific product, in this case milk. Or when the chicken guys do their LCA, they're comparing the impact of producing 1 kilogram of chicken. Then, of course, we could be tempted to compare 1 kilogram of chicken to 1 kilogram of milk, for instance, and then compare the results and say that the 1 kilogram for 1 kilogram, the impacts are different. The reality is the functional unit is not the same. So in many studies, what they try to do is to compare not kilogram of a specific product, but kilogram of protein. So can we compare the protein of chicken to the protein of milk, for instance? So that's what some organizations do, and some trying to research a bit more on that. And again, it's tricky because, we know that food and any product is more just than their components. It's actually a more complex reality. So just to answer the questions here is the fact that comparing results from an LCA is something that is technically possible because, you can compare results. They are quantified and all that. But the reality is that we're not necessarily comparing apples to apples. It's very, very complex. So that's why right now there are more and more research trying to assess the impact not of a protein or a kilogram, but of diet. Because this is how we actually consume and eat food, right? Not as a specific product, but as a whole on the plate. But again, this is where we find there's a lot of difficulties and challenges in trying to compare things like that. So all that to say that right now there are many attempts to compare the proteins and compare products together, but this is not the main objective of the studies that took place as of now. And now I will say that there is more and more research trying to develop a more standardized way and a good baseline to compare those proteins, basically those products together. Because of course there are differences across sectors and products, but also differences in where those products are being produced and how.
Great, thank you. Here is somebody asking for a comment on the following. It seems as though it's easy to consider the impact on the environment due to the dairy system we have in Canada since it's federally controlled. This would be difficult to address in the U.S., where each dairy farm is independent. I don't know if that's something you can comment on, Jean-Michel?
Well, that's actually a good question as well, and it connects back again to the complexity of the system, where there's also politics and regulations out there. Well, the reality is, there are LCAs taking place in the dairy sector pretty much everywhere around the globe. So the U.S. industry also has their own LCA, and they try to assess their performance and take action. I would say, so I won't comment on the work taking place abroad or in different countries, but the reality is, of course, is not only how you get access to the results, but it's how you take action once you get the results in order to improve the situation over time. And again, I can't comment on the reality in Europe or in the States, but for sure, I may say that in Canada, the way that the sector is organized provides them a lot of leverage in the ability to develop policies and implement those policies and programs, maybe in a more structured and streamlined way when there's an objective or a commitment. And again, I won't comment on their strategy, but of course, the way the industry is organized could definitely have an impact on how they can actually collect information, and once they have the information, to take action based on that. So I would say that yes, maybe some organizations are more in a better position than others to take action when it comes to sustainability.
Great, thank you. Another one that's just come in, what are the factors or the differences in practices that contribute to lower carbon footprints in Europe when compared to North America?
Well, like I said on the slide, so I won't get too technical, but the main drivers, again, explaining the impact of milk production for the carbon footprint. When you compare it, so why is Canada doing so well when you compare to other regions? There are two main reasons. Productivity, like I said, the fact that the animals are healthy, they're productive, they produce a lot of milk, giving what they are given in terms of food and all that. So that's one reason. So we have a productive system here. And the other reason is feed. And again, on the life cycle perspective, for all the indicators, you have to realize that feed production is one of the main factors explaining and contributing to the footprint in the livestock sector. So basically, if the sector has to work somewhere, it has to work together in collaboration with the grain producers in order to reduce the overall footprint. But the key here is the fact that in Canada, most of the feed is coming from is being sourced domestically. And when you compare that situation to other regions across the globe, then you realize that our industry is not contributing to deforestation or other practices that we see elsewhere, especially in Latin America, where you have to basically cut down forests to produce soy meal and soy and things like that, which will have a huge impact on your carbon footprint. So the fact that we are highly efficient in terms of productivity rate, but also have a feed that has a lower contribution to the overall footprint than other regions across the globe, explain the difference when you look at what are the reasons why the producing milk is we have a better footprint here than other regions across the globe, around the globe.
Okay. I see time is moving on, but we do have a couple more questions here. One is there a way to reduce the gas from the cows to reduce their carbon footprint? You mentioned that the enteric emissions currently represents almost half of the greenhouse gas emissions on dairy farms. And just as a sequel to that, how does the enteric emissions compare versus 2011? Yeah. For example, was it also 48% in 2011?
So, to answer the second part of the question, it's pretty much the same. So, like I said, it's more the intensity rather than the proportion of the contributors that changed. So, in 2011, I think it was 47%. So, pretty much the same thing. As for the ways, are there ways to reduce the gas from the cows? Yes, they are. I would say that there is a lot of research taking place actually in order to find ways to do that. And again, what is complicated here is what I mentioned earlier, is the fact that all those variables are interconnected. So let's say you may find a way or add an additive in the feed which will help reduce, let's say, I'm just using fake numbers there, half the emissions from enteric fermentation of cows. But if that additive affects the animal welfare, then we have to go back to the drawing board and find another way to reduce the footprint without affecting the other variables. So that's why there is a need for more research, and there's a lot of research taking place in Canada, but also elsewhere, to find ways to reduce that footprint of gas. Because, like I said, like you mentioned, there's of course somehow the main hotspot. So yes, there's a lot of efforts invested right now. So I won't get too technical with the examples, but there are a lot of pilots and efforts invested.
Okay, thank you. I see we're running out of time here. I just wanted to let everyone know that if they're looking for a copy of the LCA report, they can communicate directly with us. The email address is nutrition@dfc-plc.ca. I'll repeat that. nutrition@dfc-plc.ca. And again, I'd like to thank you very, very much, Jean-Michel, for your very interesting presentation and obviously some of the interesting questions that we received as well. To all of you on the line, before you leave, please don't forget to complete the evaluation form and to print the certificate of attendance. And on behalf of Dairy Farmers of Canada, I want to thank you all very, very much for your active participation. Enjoy the rest of your day.